Dr. JC here. Welcome to World History 1, Lecture 1. We're going to take a little bit of time to talk about early man, ancient Mesopotamia, and ancient Egypt. Cultural anthropologists, biologists et al., they have several different theories about human development. Now, we're not going to get into discussions about hominids here or the evolution of man, whether we evolved out of an ape or aliens visited and dropped Bigfoot on us and mermaids, all that sort of happy stuff. But I do want you to focus or think about at least these various aspects of societies: Paleolithic society, Old Stone Age, Neolithic society, meaning New Stone Age, and more specifically, this emergence of civilization. Now, as man began to settle down the end of this Neolithic period, we began to start to see the creation of cities, functioning governments within these cities, advanced art, writing, various social structures, so we have different classes within societies, and established religions. Now, any one of these six could provide us some indication that a civilization has emerged. We're going to briefly look at several different ancient civilizations over the course of the next several weeks in class. I want to start here with the ancient Mesopotamians. Now, when talking about ancient Mesopotamia, I want you to think immediately about the land between two rivers, those two rivers being the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, roughly the region of modern-day Iraq. Now, if we're talking about a land between two rivers, that should imply that rivers were fairly important. They were to ancient Mesopotamians. In fact, ancient Mesopotamia is among the first of the what we would call river valley civilizations. Beyond geography, the political structure of ancient Mesopotamia was a bit different than what we'll see in other ancient civilizations moving forward. Mesopotamia was a very decentralized political structure. That means that there's an absence of a central power. Therefore, I want you to think of ancient Mesopotamia as a series of city-states. So a very decentralized structure. And a decentralized structure will always lead to infighting. You want to go ahead and take over your neighbor if possible. Now, while each of these Mesopotamian city-states would vary in size and in power, each of them did hold something in common, and that was spirituality. Their spirituality was represented by these huge structures that were placed right in the center of the city-states, and that gives us some indication of the importance of them because they were built in the center of the city-states. And these were temples known as ziggurats. So anytime you hear the word ziggurat, I want you to think of not only temples, but ancient Mesopotamian city-states. While on the topic of spirituality, I would like to briefly mention Mesopotamian religion. Now, Mesopotamian religion is polytheistic, poly meaning more than one god. And in fact, in Mesopotamia is really more specifically henotheistic. And anytime you hear the word henotheism, I want you to think of one major god and then a series of lesser gods. So as an example of that could be like in Greek mythology where you have Zeus and then a series of lesser gods. So in Mesopotamia, they have many gods, although there is one main god. Mesopotamians also believed in an afterlife known as the Great Below. Now, the Great Below was really, from what might sound to you and I, anything but great. Your soul, when it departed this earth, went down, and you were for eternity turned into this ghost that was able to feast on dust and clay. You'd walk in shadow and darkness. Therefore, this great below, as mentioned, is anything but great. But it does give us some indication that if the great below isn't that great, how might one worry about ordering their life in the natural plane? Put another way, if the spiritual plane sucks, would you really need to worry about whether or not you were a nice lady or a nice guy in the physical world? And in some ways that will shape Mesopotamian behavior. Keep that in mind. In Mesopotamia, there is a literary tradition alongside artistic and architectural ones as well. And one of the most well-known literary works from ancient Mesopotamia is this Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, we're not going to get into the whole story of Gilgamesh. If you're interested in it, you can Google that sort of thing. But the long and short of it, as it relates to this epic, the moral of the story, for all intents and purposes, is that man is mortal. There is no eternal immortality for living individuals. Even if you happen to be a city-state king or a priest or some sort of deity within some sort of ziggurat, immortality is only for the gods, not for man. And therefore, Mesopotamians tend to be this worldly. And again, that makes sense. If the afterlife or that great below isn't that great, then they need to get all they can get in the present life. And therefore, if that means fighting for what one wants for one's family, that's what you do. Because for all intents and purposes, there is no sort of retribution in the afterlife. Now, as we begin to wrap up Mesopotamia here and get ready to move into Egypt, I want to make clear one thing here. And that is that Mesopotamians didn't necessarily live in some sort of lawless society. Surely they were this worldly, and surely their afterlife wasn't that great. But they were a structured society based on not the most fair of penal systems or codes, but one was in place, such as that depicted here, Hammurabi's Code. Now, the law would apply differently depending on one's class or caste. So if you were from the upper class and stole a vehicle versus somebody from the lower class who stole a vehicle, your penance would be much less. So in other words, if you stole something from the upper class, you might get a slap on the wrist. If you steal something and you happen to be from the lower class, you're probably going to lose a hand. So while the system wasn't absolutely fair per se, there was a codified system in place. We're going to move into Egypt next, and you'll find that there are some parallels to Egyptian society with that of ancient Mesopotamia. Most specifically, that ancient Egypt has been known as or remembered as the Gift of the Nile, dealing with the Nile River. The Nile River then, like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in ancient Mesopotamia, do make ancient Egypt also a river valley civilization, just like Mesopotamia. So there's a current likeness there for sure. Now, an important point to make here is that the Nile River actually flows from south to north. And it is the world's longest river, over 4,000 miles, starting in roughly about the center of the African continent and flowing then toward the Mediterranean Sea. Once it gets past Cairo and gets toward the Mediterranean Sea, it begins to fan out and form what's known as a delta. In some ways, it's almost like the Mississippi River in the United States, which flows from north to south. And then as you get down towards New Orleans, you have the Mississippi Delta. Anytime you have a delta, it just means that there's rich silt and sediment that's been carried from upstream, downstream, and deposited. Very nutrient rich and ridiculously important for agricultural growth and harvests. Therefore, in ancient Egypt, along the Egyptian Nile Delta, the grain harvests were excellent. And in fact, Egypt will be known for, in some sense, being the breadbasket of the ancient world. And he who controls the grain is much like controlling the gold. You control everything because you can turn on or turn off food supplies to friends and enemies and get them to act accordingly. Therefore, power will be associated with Egypt because of their control and growth of the grain. Regarding power in ancient Egypt, it isn't something that happened overnight. This takes time. No different than the United States. The United States emerged as 13 colonies and then 13 states and eventually gained some traction and became an industrial power and in some sense now in the present age a superpower. Well, it would take Egypt some time as well, and there are three different periods that Egyptologists and historians have applied to ancient Egypt itself: an Old Kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a new kingdom. And we'll go into each of these briefly, but I want you to remember or associate key terms with each, and are listed here on this slide. As it relates to the Old Kingdom, I want you to think of pyramids or pyramid building. Regarding the Middle Kingdom, a period of stability, sort of a golden age. This is where we see them really controlling the grain supply, so on and so forth. And then the final period of the Egyptian empire or civilization will be known as this New Kingdom. And I want you to think of empire as it relates to that as well. Now, in the first of these three kingdoms, the Old Kingdom, there's a couple things that begin to happen here in ancient Egypt. First and foremost, the term Pharaoh begins to be accepted and used commonly. Pharaoh in the ancient world, at least in ancient Egypt, refers to the supreme leader, not just from a spiritual sense, but also from a civil or secular sense. So tons of power there if one is seen as both a political civil leader and a religious leader. We also see as well the construction of pyramids. The best example still in existence today, and one we all know, is King Khufu's complex here at Giza. Rather than get into the particulars of the engineering feat that Giza is, you guys can Google that if you're interested. I did want to pivot a little bit to make another point as it relates to Egypt and the Old Kingdom as well. The last important point to make about the Old Kingdom here is how it was established politically. Now the Pharaoh, he or she, remember we do have some female pharaohs as well, was the supreme leader. But in order to effectively administer such a vast expanse of geographic space and different ethnic and culturally different peoples, it was deemed best to go ahead and break the kingdom down into various provinces in Upper Egypt, the Lower Egypt, and to appoint governors then to go ahead and administer the Pharaoh's law. With the Middle Kingdom, we associate that term stability. This is the golden age of Egypt. This is where Egypt's at its height. Egypt is known throughout the Mediterranean world to be the breadbasket. If you need grain, you got to go to Egypt. Therefore, everyone is trading with Egypt, and if all that money's coming in, Egyptians can use that money then for research and development to further advance their own arts and society. So this is the golden age of Egypt here in the Middle Kingdom. One of the downsides with being a rich and affluent society is sometimes you invite peoples that you don't necessarily want within your borders. That happened in the latter part of the Middle Kingdom as well with this Hyksos invasion. Egypt was invaded by the Hyksos. These peoples did come in with a new technology called a chariot, not anything the Egyptians had seen before, and for some time raised some big cane within Egypt, stuck around for a while, and forced the Egyptians to rethink their strategy and rethink their level of engineering as well. The Hyksos invasion did force Egypt to rethink its approach to peoples throughout the ancient world. Now they had the money to be able to go ahead and deconstruct and reconstruct the chariot and make it bigger and better and faster. And with this new technology then, the strategy changed. Egypt would no longer sit within its borders in trade. Rather, they would go out into other areas and root out potential enemies. This period of empire begins now. Great leaders like Thutmose and Ramses will begin to invade outside neighbors to root out potential enemies to expedite trade. The problem with this strategy, however, is you start to create enemies, you create insurgencies, and people begin to look to trade somewhere else for their grain. And this waging of perpetual war in the name of perpetual peace is ultimately going to lead to the downfall of the Egyptian society. Now to conclude Egypt and PowerPoint 1, I wanted to really briefly mention Egyptian religion. Just like in Mesopotamia, Egyptians also believed in an afterlife. The afterlife in Egypt, however, was a much better place than that so-styled Great Below in Mesopotamia. In fact, Egyptians could prepare for that afterlife with this how-to manual of sorts called the Book of the Dead. For those interested in reading more about the Book of the Dead, I'd ask that you Google that and check that out. Otherwise, we'll get ready to pivot into other civilizations. Dr. JC signing out. PowerPoint 1.